That's ultimately it, is if you can have a very well-scoped problem, then let people go and try out different solutions. I think you say that it's sort of, here's the problem, we know the problem is solved if this thing happens. Like the kind of meant is like defining very clearly the metrics for success. In that sense, it's like here's the metrics by which a solution will be judged. Then you can solve it any which way you want. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think of this from kind of startup perspective. Like a lot of stuff, what I do these days is kind of intersection of new technology development and startup formation and venture capital investing. And so there it's really just like that mindset of like, real job is to find out what is the problem to be solved and understanding that extremely thoroughly and being actually agnostic as to what the solution looks like ahead of time, because then you can just go find out like what the best solution is. It's a very tough situation to be in when it's like, I have this new technology, I just know I have to use it because I spent 5 years developing it, and now I'm looking for the right problem. It's like, well, sometimes that works, sometimes it's cool, sometimes it's technology is so amazing, it's like obviously going to be used like a self-landing rocket or some kind of humanoid robot or whatever. But more often it's from the problem first, working backwards what the ideal solution is. I would think that works in the urban design environment as well.
Welcome to the Smart Cities Council podcast. Smart Cities Council is an international organization aiming to create a safer, more beautiful, enabled, and resilient future for everyone, with more than 400,000 members and collaborators across the globe. Today, I welcome Andrew Côté from Hyperstition Incorporated to the podcast at the Smart Cities Summit North America. Andrew, may I ask you to introduce yourself and your organization?
Absolutely. I would be happy to introduce myself. I'm professionally speaking an engineering physicist that's worked in a few different areas of technology development. Mostly radio frequency engineering for particle beam development, and then a few years in biotech, and then I had a small AI company sort of a couple of years before ChatGPT using large language models for knowledge management, early stage drug discovery. That company didn't really take off, and so I went back to physics and I worked in nuclear fusion, designing superconducting magnet systems for magnetic confinement fusion for energy production. And more recently, I've sort of started my own company called Hyperstition Incorporated. Our business model is science fiction as a future, and we do that through events, media, getting long-form content online, explaining emerging areas of frontier technologies that are enabled by fundamental advancements in science and engineering, different from a lot of technology startups, which are often just sort of reconfiguring existing technologies to address an otherwise unmet market need. This is fundamental new things like silicon photonics, biomedical therapeutics, new diagnostic platforms, supersonic jets, space-based imaging systems, all this kind of stuff we like to call deep tech. And so these days, one of the biggest things I spend my time on is producing and running this conference called Deep Tech Week, kind of decentralized open source conference where really anyone is welcome to come and host an event and share in the kind of marketing hype umbrella. And so far we've done 2 cities last year in San Francisco, where we had about 5,600 people turn out, around 50 events. There was 950 startups and 430 venture capital funds. A few weeks ago we did New York, and that was similar numbers of startups and VC funds, about maybe 35 events. Doing SF again in June 22nd, 27th, and then at the end of the year Dubai. And after that, every city on the planet that has more than 1 million people will one day have a Deep Tech Week. Because Deep Tech really, it's for humanity. It's for us to all understand how we can step into what I call the science fiction future that is maybe just 5 or 10 years away. And artificial intelligence is only going to accelerate that transition. And it's actually hard to understand how different things might be in a good direction. And I can talk lots about that, but that's kind of me and what I do.
I would say that you had a very wandering path, which still leads straight to your deep tech interest currently, which is very interesting because you are working with very different aspects. And I'm curious whether these lead directly to smart cities. What do you mean by the term smart city, and how do you connect with the term smart city?
Path is actually more wandering than I even let on initially, because before I went to school for engineering, I did a degree in sociology and economics and worked in marketing and sales and property development. And so urban development, urban design, the sociology of urban spaces, economic development, and institutional change are all things that before I got into new technology development were things I was very familiar with and thought a lot about, especially in the context of economic stratification and social inequality. There's this ship of Theseus problem with developing a city, which is that the ship of Theseus is used by the Argonauts to go all over Greece, solving mysteries and conquering gorgons and stuff, but they have to keep the ship running while they repair it. And the same is true for a city. And so you can't just like close down a whole city at once and build everything from scratch. It has to have this kind of adaptive change over time that maintains functionality for its residents across a great number of things at once, right? So there's this great physicist named Jeffrey West from the Los Alamos laboratory that now he works at the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems Analysis. And he did a lot of analysis on the thermodynamics of cities. And cities have a very interesting dynamic where the denser a city and the higher its population, the more economies of scale you get on infrastructure. And so thinking about that, it's really, smart cities is a way of integrating new technologies that can manage information services, public services, health, transportation, water, utilities, all these things that make a city not just a place people live, but a place people flourish. And technology is very quick to be adopted in the commercial sector, where people compete in markets and it's easy to replace things. Cities are much slower to adapt and change. So in my mind, a smart city, it's not just people thinking with intelligent intentionality around issues of urban design, transportation, and the co-creation of spaces. I think there's this kind of tragedy of the North American city, which became way overly dependent on the automobile, with this suburbanization, you had this degradation of public space, everything is now commercialized. I think European cities seem to have mastered the art of humane living in city environments. And so it's kind of, how do you have the forces of industrialization and new technology development able to be integrated into spaces that are still humane and allow for very humane lives, where we still have public space, we still have access to greenery, we have high quality of public services. So it's not just a matter of developing new technology, it's understanding what are the ethical, socially responsible ways of integrating that into people's daily lives within the institutional regulatory framework of a city that has so many different stakeholders all competing to have their voices heard.
Since you are talking about technology from many different aspects, what does technology mean to you?
Yeah, well, the root word techne comes from Greek, and it means a created thing, I think, or something that is artificial. Technology is basically just any kind of tool that we use to solve a problem. That's very broad, right? What do I mean by that? In the modern context it's some application of engineering principles, science that's been reduced to engineering practice that now can be used in some kind of reliable fashion to do something. I mean, it's very broad. Technology, so democracy is a technology, okay? Manners are a technology for dealing with strangers in a way that's respectful. Traffic laws are a technology. So technology is any kind of just human-designed system that coordinates action, that brings productive leverage to bear on a problem, that magnifies the efforts of an individual. So it's pretty much, it is any means by which we adapt and respond to a changing environmental circumstance or learn to coordinate our actions with one another. I mean, very broad. It's very broad. But now people really think technology, well, software, that's robots, that's rockets, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's what we call deep tech traditionally. So, but yeah, I think technology spans both, culture, institutions, as well as things we think of as developed by people with engineering degrees. And I think that's what's interesting these days is democracy and bureaucracy and our methods of self-governance in city councils and state-level administrative, organizations. That is a generation of technology that was kind of built up, starting in the late 1700s and then throughout the 1800s. And, the Constitution of the United States was actually designed to be changed and updated constantly, and it just is not, right? And I think now we can have this idea of software is able to execute rules and programmatic logic in a way that we would actually want our government rules to run. Things that have basically people on committees that are subject to bias and insider dealing or political capture or regulatory capture of markets is bad. It means that the rules are being applied unjustly and unfairly. And I think this idea of future of governance and self-governance can be more like government as an API call, where the rules are applied equally, fairly, automatically, because it is programmatic, because it is codified into software, and software that can execute without respect to, well, this person's rich and they have tons of connections, so they get a sweet deal, and this person doesn't, and so they get ignored. And I think that's probably one of these big things with cities are politicized by entrenched interests. And I live in San Francisco, I know exactly what I'm talking about, because here it's you can't develop stuff faster than 9 years for all the permitting, and it's going to block that person's view, and that's the city councilor's cousin or something, and so it's going to get denied. And so I think, smart city, it's like, how do we adapt these information processing, decision-making technologies into our methods of self-governance to actually have a faster speed of execution? And that's necessary to keep up with the pace of change. I think basically we're at the point now where our social systems are the bottleneck to technological progress for limiting how fast we can roll out things. So that's a lot.
You are talking about governance and self-governance.
Yeah.
And I would love to ask you to compare the two. And usually I also ask, what is the role of the government or governance in establishing smart cities or the future of cities which could be smarter? Because depending on the interviewee, they would highlight different roles for the government. What is the difference for you between governance and self-governance? And what is the role in the government in establishing the smart city?
I don't know if I actually believe in governance that is not self-governance, because that is governing other people. I think the point of representative democracy is to enable self-governance, is to have your viewpoints represented at some level of decision-making that affects you. Now, it's not to say that you get to make up all the rules for yourself completely, because we have to solve this complicated multi-party coordination game of how to get along in a complicated society. I do think I would agree in the sense of good governance is the thing that kind of maximizes the degree of self-determination at the individual level, at the family level, at the city level, at the state level. I don't believe that you should have a heavy-handed federal government coming in and telling cities how to live their lives or mandating certain things. I think people have a right to choose how to live locally. And what works in, the States is a big country, but many countries have huge regional variations in culture and beliefs and ways of living. And I don't think park regulations that work in Texas are going to be the same that work in Seattle and stuff. It just doesn't make sense. So I think self-governance is, in my mind, it's the way it should be. That's the whole point. What the role of governments is in enabling self-cities, I have to essentially set up some kind of framework that enables the effective coordination of these supply and demand issues. I don't know, government procurement is not something that I think has successfully worked in a lot of places, especially in the United States and North America, because interests are so politicized and so captured, and often giving lucrative sweetheart deals to insiders in this kind of revolving door in San Francisco, at least. That's certainly true. Some cities are a lot better than this than others. So I think the role of government is to establish rules of the road by which people can conduct themselves. And I think people, in the pursuit of their own self-interest, when the rules of the road are constructed such that it orients people towards playing positive-sum games and enables these kinds of market mechanisms to efficiently allocate solutions with problems, I don't think the government's role is to tell you how to drive, specifically which route to take. I think that's a top-down command-style economy that I think just doesn't work. I think the market is essentially a distributed information processing mechanism that can solve problems that no one person can even comprehend. And so in that sense, I think the government should basically say, look, here are the solutions we're looking for. Here are the ways in which you can get solutions adopted, and it should be kind of blind sense, and it's you assess solutions on their merits, and here's the requirements you have to meet. I think setting specifications in terms of the functional description, what it should do, versus the implementation details in terms of how it should do those things, I think that's probably the best way to go, because often people, and you see this a lot with the defense industry, where if you specify how things have to be implemented, then you've already narrowed the set of solutions you're willing to look at. Whereas if you just state the problem requirements, here's what a good solution should do, not here's how a good solution must work to be accepted, then you actually let people go use their agentic creativity and their knowledge of things outside of the minds of a person specifying the problem requirements to go think of something novel. And so I think that's, in my mind, that's define the rules of the road, how do people compete to have the winning solution, and then let them go compete and do those things.
I'm also curious about this part because you mentioned that it would be enough to explain the outcome and let the competitors, the participants, whatever, find how they want to solve that problem or how they want to arrive to that outcome. I'm curious, what do you think about the problem of stating the outcome instead of stating the problem? I'm asking this because In the built environment, I'm an architect, and sometimes clients come to us that I want to have this house, or I want to have this park, or I want to have this road here. And sometimes we need to ask back, what is the problem you want to solve? Instead of blindly, okay, here is your house, or here is your road, or here is your park.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, although the client think that specific outcome would be the solution, as a spatial expert, I can give them a better solution, which would solve not just that specific problem, but maybe others as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's ultimately it, is if you can have a very well-scoped problem, then let people go and try out different solutions. I think you say that it's sort of, here's the problem, we know the problem is solved if this thing happens. Like the kind of meant is like defining very clearly the metrics for success. In that sense. It's like, here's the metrics by which a solution will be judged, then you can solve it any which way you want. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think of this from kind of startup perspective. Like a lot of stuff, what I do these days, it's kind of intersection of new technology development and startup formation and venture capital investing. And so there it's really just like that mindset of like, real job is to find out what is the problem to be solved and understanding that extremely thoroughly and being actually agnostic as to what the solution looks like ahead of time, because then you can just go find out like what the best solution is. It's a very tough situation to be in when it's like, I have this new technology, I just know I have to use it because I spent 5 years developing it, and now I'm looking for the right problem. It's like, well, sometimes that works, sometimes it's cool, sometimes it's technology is so amazing, it's like obviously going to be used like a self-landing rocket or some kind of humanoid robot or whatever. But more often it's thinking like, from the problem first, working backwards what the ideal solution is. I would think that works in the urban design environment as well. I think the thing though is probably that people have a lot of inertia and cultural tradition and conventional sort of ways of living that they would not want disrupted. It's like, okay, the problem is traffic jams, and the solution is, okay, we're gonna lock cars and everyone's gonna slide around in these pneumatic tubes or something. And it's like, maybe that's not gonna work. Maybe people don't like the pneumatic tubes and they want to keep their cars and stuff. So there's gonna be, I think in cities, it's not just like, it's the ship of Theseus problem, right? Where it's like there must be this continual functional nature to the city elements, as well as people have like inertia or cultural preferences in terms of how they live their life. And those are, I think, very regionally variable too. So I'd be very surprised considering how different cities can be, what kind of solutions work best, don't work well in others. Yeah. That being said, it's funny, all cities must perform a certain level of functions in utilities and transportation and zoning and that kind of stuff. At the same time, every city exists in a different regional location and cultural context. So those are the boundary conditions to match. And so since some boundary conditions are always the same and some are always different, I think you'll have some degree of variance in the ideal solutions for each place.
What do you think are the biggest opportunities for smart cities?
Okay, well, it's not a question because I kind of said it's like every city is going to be different in some way. I can interpret that in the lens of like what I see as like things on the near term being developed that I think are very compelling and can be deployed at scale effectively and reasonably. Okay, I think certainly this autonomous transportation thing is very revolutionary. Because I mean, congestion and the traffic is massive, and street level parking. One thing that I think tends to work well in a lot of places is having more kind of mixed use, integrated bicycle lanes, pedestrian zones, outdoor dining, that kind of stuff. Like that started in San Francisco in the pandemic, it's kind of stuck around. That creates a much more human, walkable, enjoyable city experience, I think. And so reducing the fraction of space dedicated to paved roadways by adopting things like autonomous transportation that are now distributed or shared, I think that's pretty awesome. But many places are going to be like very strong in car ownership. They're already suburbanized. They're very distributed. It's not going to work there. I think certainly, okay, one thing that I think for sure is what I mentioned before, which is like the introduction of software systems into bureaucratic processes. A lot of standardized review processes. I want to throw a special event. I want to apply for a permit to modify my house. I want to, whatever, any kind of point of interface from like an individual citizen or small business perspective with like city faculties. That can certainly be massively accelerated. I think having like very drawn out review processes that take years to get things done, or just hundreds of steps involved, I think those things can probably be massively accelerated. And mainly because we now have like basically a natural language programming system in the form of large language models and AI. So I think it's, okay, we have a plan, and it has to match 50 years of regulations that govern such activities, and they exist scattered over 100 different documents with some degrees of overlap across those documents. Okay, are we going to have like a team of lawyers that go through that, or can we use like a software tool that can kind of help massively accelerate that process, right? I think it's like having that on both sides. You know, it's like I go to the city, I say, here's what I want to do, and they kind of interpret that in a way that's, okay, here's the requirements that apply to you, this kind of stuff. So navigating that bureaucracy component, I think, could probably be massively accelerated. There's probably a lot of other things too, in terms of like, something that's more like nationally variable, but what does healthcare look like? Does like mixed use commercial residential development look like? What are building materials and building construction and like environmental certifications around that? What kind of buildings are used? I think like things like, solar panels are now extremely cheap and much more efficient than they ever have been before. Integrated solar and battery solutions to have a more resilient grid is huge. I think, Maine just had this massive blackout, ironically enough, because they're so heavily reliant on solar, but that's the sort of point where it's like, maybe, regional stability in electrical production, you need to have a more mixed energy grid, and that the solar plus battery systems deployed in residential context creates like a kind of resiliency at the small scale. If you have some large blackout event, residents and buildings are not actually going to full blackout, they have backup systems, and that can also help with things like load balancing and smart grid development, which has been talked about for decades and for some reason still isn't rolled out adequately for some reason. So I think probably and this is I think the ironic thing of kind of picking up on this conference here today, or last couple of days, is I think it's sometimes a lot of like we think of as conventionally less developed or more emerging cities are more quicker to adopt these solutions because they're actually just like genuinely more eager, and perhaps they have less inertia of like past systems that need to be torn up to adopt something new. I think it's kind of ironic where perhaps like Singapore is like a city-state almost, can move very quickly on these things, whereas other cities are like much more difficult to get. Like San Francisco is like just the most ironic case because it's like the center of so much technology development, and then like just a badly governed city. Although now we've had a new mayor, so things are turning around. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, it's kind of, you might actually look for like cities that are kind of incoming, rapidly developing, rapidly growing as most able to move quickly and adopt these things, whereas they're kind of just in more of like a faster executive decision-making loop, and they can kind of skip like past failed solutions that have a lot of inertia to them.
Also, they don't have the existing infrastructure to stick to, and that makes it much easier to...
Yep, totally. Yeah, like they're not going to build a bunch of lead pipes or something like that.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Now, you are working with emerging technologies and practices. What advice would you give about these emerging technologies and practices?
Oh my God, I mean, it's a very general question.
Yes.
Lots of like very conventional sort of startup-y advice that people like to give out, like 100 people that love you versus 1,000 people that are kind of or just willing to try it once. I don't know, I think you gotta be more specific than that. Apart from just like, it's gonna be harder than you think, and probably if you knew how hard it was gonna be, you wouldn't have tried it in the first place, but that's like a feature, not a bug, where like the veil of ignorance is required to take on a great degree of suffering, but now you've suffered so much, you have this kind of sunk cost fallacy, like you're not gonna give up. That's probably like something to expect and look forward to. And it's this classic thing where it's like, you want to be strong, you should seek adversity, so suffering is the road to strength. Probably something like raising money is going to be a lot harder than you think. Maybe perhaps another framing that I think is less popular in San Francisco is like, actually not everything is a startup. And probably like from the founder's perspective, like the startup venture-backed trajectory has like one of the lowest expectation values in terms of like you weight the outcomes over number of that outcome. Whereas like if there's a way to start this company in a way that's like profitable and you can grow through revenue over time, that has like a much higher expectation value for like your personal wealth and growth, that kind of stuff. And then also, I would say also it's like if the hardest part about your company technology is raising money and it has to be a startup because of its own capital requirements, it's probably not a good idea. Like the hardest part should be technology development or finding customers in that sense, or at least if it's new technology development, the hardest part should definitely be the technology development, because if it's something new, the customers should be desperate to get it, and because they're desperate to get it, people are like, that's a no-brainer. And if the technology was very easy to develop and the customers are very hard to get and fundraising is nearly impossible, it's probably not as useful as you think, and you probably are now in this kind of golden hammer fallacy of like thinking that this is such a cool thing, I just need to convince people to want it. Well, maybe that's true, but I mean, things like, a great example is a car that drives itself, right? It's just, of course, people are going to want that. People hate driving. It's like very rarely enjoyable. Some stretches of California are great for driving, but most of the time it sucks. There's like lots of things that I could say to convince a person to not pursue a startup, and if they were to listen to any of those, then they're definitely not someone that should pursue a startup. And so you have to have this like absolutely unreasonable conviction that like I'm the chosen one, and I'm going to change the world, and I'm like deep tech messiah, going to like usher in a new age of prosperity and abundance. And if you're that delusional and confident, then I'd say it's like probably you should do this, at least because if you're right, then the world needs it, and if you're wrong, you can at least get like a more grounded view of reality.
Okay, I love this advice. What advice would you give to the other side, to the consumer side, to the client side, regarding emerging technologies and practices?
Oh, yeah. So if you asked a consumer in 1985, like, what do they want? They'd be like, I want a pager with a bigger screen. I want a Walkman with longer battery life. I want iPhones that are waterproof, and I want, kind of stuff. Like, no one would be thinking about the iPhone. And so it's that kind of stuff where it's like, that is like what you said, it's a difference between like problem specification and implementation specification. And so probably thinking of the problems first, and then being open to like seeing how things can work and like changing your internal practices. I think that's one thing. Open to trying new things, I guess, obvious. I don't know. I mean, see, that's the thing. If the solution is compelling, it should be obvious, and you should want to try it. And I mean, I think that's the thing I'm less worried about. Like consumers and client side or buyer side of new technology, they're always self-optimizing because often they're like trying to survive or trying to make their business more cost-effective or more competitive or have a better lifestyle, better quality of living. And so they're pretty like, I think, discerning. I think. I would say maybe like be wary of hype, marketing and storytelling, and like the ideal amount of marketing is not zero, but if something is like way more marketing than substance, then that's like probably a warning sign, or I don't know. But I think people are pretty discerning usually.
I hope you're right. But at the same time, I want to be respectful of your time, Andrew, and I want to let you get back to the summit itself. What would you like people to take away from the summit?
If you went to a farmer in the 1600s and showed them a photo of a city in 1850, they'd say like it's unrecognizable in terms of the pace of change and how drastically both social institutions and life changed. And people came from this place of like relatively material scarcity into relative material abundance. And I think basically we're going to undergo another change that's at least as substantial as the Industrial Revolution in terms of like how it's going to change both material abundance and now abundance of knowledge services and intelligence. And I think access to knowledge services has been a long time like a big barrier to meritocratic achievement, with if it's like personal health, counseling, tutoring, dietitian, whatever, all this kind of stuff. So I think this is like probably one of the most interesting times to be alive and probably the best time in history to be alive. And so you should be very optimistic about the future.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time, and please keep up this good work because what you are doing is freaking amazing and interesting.
Thanks.
Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
No, you should come to Deep Tech Week in San Francisco on June 22nd and 27th, and it's going to be awesome. It's just a bunch of sci-fi technologies that are all, this stuff all the time, and that's why I'm saying it's like the future is going to be beyond belief. It's like, realize all this stuff is going to be deployed in the next few years. It's nuts, and so come check it out.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks.
If you want to learn more about Andrew Côté, links will be provided in the show notes, and the Smart Cities Council website can info you even more. What have you learned from this interview? What questions do you have after listening to Andrew? What would you like to know more about? Let us know on the Smart Cities Council website and on LinkedIn. Look out for other episodes and topical discussions, and thanks for tuning in.